Right, okay, so welcome to our talk on how to use the legislation and exam technique, which I'm hoping to do in roughly about an hour. Okay, so the legislation. It doesn't matter if you use CCH or if you use Tolley's. Obviously I use Tolley's because I get it for free. They're all the same, really. But what matters is how you use them in the exam. And to be honest, you won't use them as much as you might think in the exam. But we have to have them there because they're like a comfort blanket, aren't they? So we don't lose the exam without them. But you won't use them too much, but you could use them in a way that really helps you if you know what to do. Now, first thing I want to talk about is marking up the legislation. What you're allowed to do is underline anything, you can sideline, and you can highlight. What you can't do is take your highlighter pen and go down the side here. What you have to do if you want to be able to see something is to go to each individual page and go down the side, yes, like this, so that you can still see a highlighter mark. You are allowed to write your name in it, either down the side or somewhere inside it, but that is the only writing that's allowed. You can't annotate, you can't use post-it notes, you're not allowed to fold over pages like that, but wear and tear is allowed, and obviously that helps things open in certain places, yes, and obviously scrunching up pages because that's wear and tear. The trouble about scrunching the pages is they start to flatten out after a while. So you actually have to do it the night before, but that's another story. So wear and tear, that's fine. Now, what you need to have in your mind is roughly where is everything that might be useful to me in the legislation. So you need to know roughly what's in every volume and where the contents are, which are at the start of each act, and where the index is. You won't use the index very much, thank goodness, because it's a rubbish index, even if I say so myself. The index is not very good, but you might need it in an emergency. So you just need to roughly have an idea of what's in every book. And obviously it goes chronologically. So, you know, you start off with Taxation of Chargeable Gains Act, so that's obviously everything to do with CGT. Then it's a TIPA, earnings and pensions. So anything to do with earnings, employment income, is in a TIPA. The TOIA is trading income, trading and other income. So anything to do with trading is in a TOIA. The Income Taxes Act is all about how you calculate income tax. So that's where you have your personal allowances, your tax reducers. Anything to do with an income tax comp is in the Income Taxes Act. Then you have your corporation tax, which is basically same as a TOIA really, adjustment of profit, and then same as Income Taxes Act, charging to corporation tax. Then you've got your overseas stuff. Inheritance tax, that's somewhere else, so is national insurance, VAT and stamp taxes. But for income tax, CGT, CGT and corporation tax, they're all in parts 1 to C, chronologically in order. Then you have other bits and pieces that could be really useful, like the statutory instruments, extra statutory concessions. Make sure you know where these are. These are what I call hidden gems. We'll have a look at some of these later, but there's some really useful stuff in this part 2, as I call it, or it'll be 1F for you using CCH. So, as I've said, book 1, which for Tolley's is 1, 2, 3, this is where you're going to have your income tax, your corporation tax and CGT. It's in chronological order. Now, where you have the grey shading, this grey shading down the side, these are the big acts, the consolidated acts. Where it's not got grey shading, it's just single little finance acts that you probably won't ever look up. The only time you might be looking up single finance acts is when you get to penalties. But then again, you might not, because there's somewhere that's better than there that we'll talk about later for penalties. And basically, as I've said, the acts sort of take you through the income tax comp. So employment income is a TIPA, trading income and property income is a TOIA. Then you're going to get down through your other sort of income. And that will get you down to taxable income, as we all know and love. And then to actually tax it, you're in the Income Taxes Act. Similarly, for corporation tax, how to adjust profits and get down to TTP is your first Corporation Tax Act, and then your second one tells you how to tax it. So, that's a brief overview of the legislation, but how are you going to use that legislation in the exam? Very, very time-pressured exams. You really haven't got the time to keep looking things up. Most things have to be in your head that you can apply. So you're only going to be looking up things you can't remember or you don't want to remember because they're too boring to remember. So things like definitions, conditions, that sort of thing. Most things you need to know. You shouldn't be looking up how to work out a car benefit. You should know that. And anyhow, it's in the tax tables. Yes? You should only be using the legislation where it's, oh right, EMI, full-time worker. Can't remember what full-time worker is. I'll just look that condition up. That sort of thing. So it's a memory jogger. So there's different ways you can highlight your legislation. The first way is what I call memory jogger highlighting. And it's a way that you highlight that it will just make something jump out at you and you remember, oh yes, that's what I'm supposed to do. So for example, this is the Income Taxes Act. This is the contents at the start of the Income Taxes Act. At the start of each of these grey blobs, there's a lovely content section that tells you everything that's in the grey blob. Now you can highlight these content sections in a way that become a memory jogger for you. So if we think about using trading losses, there's a whole variety of things you can do at trading losses, isn't there? You can set it against your general income. You can then take it down and use it against a capital gain. You can, if you're in the opening years of your business, have that relief where you take the loss back 3 years, earliest year first, or carry it forward, or if you're ceasing to trade, terminal loss relief. Now I could just highlight those headings in the content section and I've got a rough summary, a reminder, a memory jogger of every option open to me when it comes to loss relief. Similarly, in the TIPA, earnings and pensions, I can use the contents pages and colour highlighting to help me remember taxable benefits, non-taxable benefits, yes? So red is bad, green is good. So taxable benefits are things like cash vouchers, living accommodation. There's something about accommodation costing more than 75,000, isn't there? Do you remember that one? Expensive accommodation. Cars, vans. So contributions. I've done this in yellow because this is to remind me that if they make a capital contribution towards having the car provided, I can take that off the list price, yes? So it's just a sort of a memory jogger in case it's the sort of thing I might forget. You might be sitting there thinking, I know all this stuff, and that's good. But sometimes in the exam, you can just go blank. And you just need to think, right, and suddenly look something up and then calm down again. It can happen under the stress of the exam. Green is good, so mileage allowances are okay, passenger payments, travel and subsistence, that sort of thing, not taxable benefit. Work-related training, parties, only up to a certain amount, yes, which is £150. So you can colour code the contents to become quite a memory joggery type experience for you if you think you're going to go blank. The next type of highlighting is what I would call highlighting the conditions. So this is where you're preparing for a written question. So tell me everything you know about a certain share scheme. Now, all those conditions you're not going to have here, but you're going to have prepared the legislation so that you can open it and write your question, write your answer rather. So, let's take EIS Relief. EIS Relief is a tax reducer, yes? Reduces the tax bill. The main conditions for EIS Relief are it has to be the right kind of shares in the right kind of company. There's limits on the investment, limits on the person. There's lots and lots and lots of conditions going on here. Now, it's a tax reducer, so it's all to do with calculating the tax bill. So it's in the Income Taxes Act, okay? Now, when I come to write up my answer, here is the contents of the Income Taxes Act. If I've done my highlighting correctly, the key points are all that I will have highlighted. So rather than looking at that, which is where I have to read everything, and I haven't got time to read everything, I do that. So I've just got the keywords: trading, qualifying business activity, unquoted, gross assets, employees. In fact, if I knew it well enough, I could now write my answer only from the contents page, yes? But if I needed more information, then I delve into the relevant section number in the Act itself. Now again, this is section 183. I don't want to be looking at this in the real exam. I haven't got time to look at that in the real exam. I want to have prepared it so that only the key words have been highlighted. So, qualifying business activity is a relevant qualifying trade. What's a qualifying trade? It's not excluded activities. What are excluded activities? It's not one of these, yes? And what I've highlighted here are things that are quite common, or maybe I've come across in a past paper question, because you never know, that might come up again. So what I mean by preparing the legislation is getting it ready. You're going to get it ready at CTA, you're going to get it ready for potentially 30 questions, and if one of them comes up, fab, yes? But that's what I mean. You need it to be ready to go with a written answer. Again, the gross assets requirement, I don't want to be looking at that. I just want to be looking at what's relevant. So value of company assets not exceed 15 million before, 16 million after. So just the keywords highlighted. So I've got it all prepared. My conditions are all prepared to go. Another way you can highlight is to use it as a signpost to point you in the right direction. Now, Capital Allowances Act is, guess what? Capital allowances. And plant and machinery is what we get capital allowances on. Now, machinery is obvious. What's machinery? Plant is the grey area. So, section 21 says what is not plant, because it's a building. Section 22, structures, not plant. Section 23, things that look like those, but actually they are plant. So what I've done is I've highlighted it in colour to remind me, not plant, oh, but that is plant. So you signposted it to make it just that little bit easier when you come to look at it, to remember, oh yeah, this is the plant and that's the one that isn't. Then inside the legislation itself, because that was the contents page, I've now again just highlighted what I need. So plant is not a building. Buildings of these things here. And is not a structure. Structure are these things here. But section 21 and 22 do not apply to these things, so they may look like buildings, they may look like structures, but hey, they're in green, so they're all right. They are plant. And again, in List C. List C follows on from section 23. List C is a list of all the bizarre cases that have happened in the past that have said things like swimming pools are plant, and they've just put them in a list. So you just highlight the ones you may have seen, partition walls, movable partition walls, that sort of thing, in past paper questions will tend to crop up quite a bit. So what you're doing is you're just making life a bit easier for yourself using colour. Now, for those of you doing VAT, there's some of you in the room doing VAT, how do they know? Obviously, you're into the orange books. And the main bits that we need to know for VAT are just two real bits in there, which is VART of the main act, and then there's a fabulous statutory instrument. Those of you doing awareness CTA, we only really look at these two here. Those of you doing the indirect route, you'll be delving into quite a bit more. But, again, you can use highlighting to help you, especially in areas that are just a little bit more tricky. So, for example, VAT and food, yes? So, this is Schedule 8, which is the 0 rating schedule. This is going to tell us what's 0 rated. But I've got it colour-coded, haven't I? Because it says everything is 0 rated except catering, so that's in red, not 0 rated, or accepted items. The stuff that's 0 rated are the general items, i.e. food. The stuff that isn't, the red stuff, is the stuff you shouldn't eat, like chocolate and crisps, that sort of thing, and that's in the accepted items. But then we have exceptions to the accepted items, so I'm back to green again, because now tea is all right and so is coffee. So VAT, in particular, can be a very twisted sort of legislation, but if you colour code it, then you look at it quickly in the exam without getting yourself caught up in the, oh gosh, it's going backwards and forwards here, I don't know what's happening, but you've colour coded it to remind yourself this red stuff is not and this green stuff is. Now, everyone has their own colour coding. These are only examples. Some people might do it differently, but this is just how it works for me. What you have to be careful of, and I've seen this, is you open someone's book and it looks like a Christmas tree. There's 7, 10, 14 different codes. You think, how do you even know what that is, You have to take it to a certain level, but only so far. Oh, I'm carrying on with food. I got all excited here. So again, we're back to red. So the key sorts of things that you should have highlighted are basic conditions. So conditions you need to meet for certain, let's say, CGT reliefs, like rollover, incorporation, entrepreneurs relief, that sort of thing, principal private residence relief. Now, a lot of you might know these really well. You don't need to highlight them. Good. But if you don't know them, they're the sorts of things you really need to highlight. So the Capital Allowances Act, obviously the plant and machinery definition, and then other things like annual investment allowance or what's an integral feature, all that sort of thing. In a TPA, if you can't remember the benefits, then again, you might need to get those highlighted, but most definitely conditions for the share schemes, because they're sort of similar, but they're sort of different, and you can get yourself really muddled in the exam. Sometimes in the exam, it's worth saying, right, this is an EMI, I'll just remind myself, oh yeah, that's the EMI, right, off I go. So you don't confuse it with another scheme. TOIA, trade profits. For my people who are here today doing paper 2A, you might want to do basis periods, opening year rules, although I did tell you you need to learn that, yes? Partnerships, little bit in partnerships there. Income Taxes Act, the tax reducers have lots of conditions going on there, want to highlight. And then, as I say, maybe, if you can't remember them, you might want to highlight losses and what you can do with losses. Penalties, you might want to highlight it in the Act, but I'm going to show you somewhere that's a bit more user-friendly in a moment. Definitely, if you're doing individuals, you might need to, or you will need to, highlight the statutory residence test, because no one's going to be able to learn that one off by heart. And then for corporation tax, you might want to do the detail for loan relationships and IFAs. Only you know what you might need to really look up for your paper. They're all going to be varied, depends on which paper you're doing. But then we get into the hidden gems. So those were the main acts, and they're great. But now we get into part 2, and what was it, 1F for CCH. Quite a substantial book. Wonderful bedtime reading. Wonderful. Loads of stuff in here. I discover stuff all the time I never knew was there. It's fabulous. So you've got all sorts of things like statements of practice. So, for example, what's a short life asset, all that sort of thing. Some HMRC briefs. A really nice one on CGT and partnerships, if any of you are doing the OMB paper. But my particular favourite section is the COP section, which is this one, the very last grey blob on the bottom here. Now this COP section here, it's got some really nice stuff in it. Employed versus self-employed. Am I employed or self-employed? Are my workers employed or self-employed? This is the leaflet the revenue sends out to the public, which means what? You can understand it, yes? It's set out beautifully. If you had a question on that, you'd just be copying it straight out of the leaflet. And there's no problem with copying things straight out of these books. But the other bit that's nice about the COP section is it's also got the leaflets to do with penalties. And these are all beautifully set out, little tables. Oh, gorgeous. Much better than the Finance Acts, yes? And yet no one seems to know they're there. But now you do. Because penalties are one of those things, aren't they, that, you know, you don't want to commit to memory. What else have I got? Also in here, in the miscellaneous section, so that's the last grey blob on the top, there's some cracking stuff in there as well. So, for example, those of you doing income tax and overseas stuff, you've got the RDRs. So this is, am I resident? Statutory residence test. It's got a flow chart. You can go down to work out whether someone's resident or not. It's got domicile. It's got stuff about remittance basis. It's a gift. And again, it's the leaflet that has been issued for the public, which means what? Again, you can read it. There's probably too much. There's even more than we have in our study packs. So you might have to be careful you don't overdo it. There's IR35, personal service companies, yes. Much nicer to look at it in this section because it's again a leaflet rather than in the legislation, because it even gives you little examples and guides you through the calculation of the deemed payment. We've got stuff on anti-money laundering and DOTAs. It's just, you know, seriously, this weekend, get this book out and just have a look through that miscellaneous section. It's fabulous. National insurance, in your national insurance book, this statutory instrument here is something you definitely want highlighted if you're going to have to do the national insurance maxima. So the annual maximas, again, not something you're going to want to learn. just need to find that statutory instrument, which most people can't. And as I've said, for VAT, that's a fabulous statutory instrument as well. It's got the vata of the rules. This statutory instrument sort of applies the rules. So it's partial exemption, and it's got some bad debt relief stuff, and it's got all the cash accounting and annual accounting schemes in it. Very, very useful. And then we come to the index. Now, the way that the index works is for CCH, they just have a book that's called the index, which is quite nice and neat. Tolley's, not so good. In Tolley's, the index for book 1 is at the end of 1C. And then the index for inheritance tax is at the end of inheritance tax. The index for NIC is at the end of the NIC blob. And then the index for VAT, whoops, is at the end of the VAT book. Whether it's CCH or Tolley's, there's 2 parts to every index. Did you know that? 2 parts to the index. There's the normal index, and then there's a smaller, shorter index called the words and phrases in Tolley's, or definitions and meanings in CCH. This is what I call the noddy index, and that's the index you should always use first, because that's the nice, simple index. If you can't find it in that index, then go to the normal index. Now, the index is not very useful. It should be a last resort. It would be better, you said to yourself, well, it's about a benefit, so it must be in a TEPA. I'll just go down through the contents at the front of a TEPA. You'd be more likely to find what you need. But if you just can't think of where this thing could be, then you're going to have to use the index. And it's not necessarily where you think it's going to be. You have to be able to think laterally, yes? So, let's say I wanted to know about personal service companies. I can't remember where that is. I don't know where that is. So I look up in both of the noddy and the other index, personal service company, and there's nothing. So, you won't see it, you won't be able to find it in the index. So what else could I look up? What else could I look up? So I look up IR35, because I know that it's the IR35 stuff. And I look it up, and that's not there either. So now what am I going to do? So you can see how the panic's rising, can't you? In exam, you can't find the thing. That's why the index is not helpful. I know it's deemed employment income, so I'll look that one up. That's not there either. It's actually under intermediary. So I know it's an example, but it's an example. Has anyone ever had to use the index? Have you ever tried to look things up in the index? Anyone? It's not useful, is it? It's not helpful at all. Don't know who writes them. They won't tell me because they know I'm going to kill him. No. So, highlighting golden rules. Less is better than more. You cannot rub out highlighting. You can always add a bit more later, but you can't rub it out. If you've highlighted everything, what do you have to read? Everything. And you just haven't got time. So you need to be very careful when you highlight that you've thought about it before you've highlighted. When I see students highlighting in class, I have to stop them because they just go, woo, and I go, no! Single word. That's all you need. Think before you highlight. How will I highlight this in a way that will help me in the exam? If you highlight an act, so if you highlight a section number, always highlight the contents page. Because, oh, I know it's in a TEPA. Yes, oh, well, where is it? Oh, God, where is it? Where is it? I haven't got time to flick through the whole of a TEPA, yes? You won't remember the section number in the exam. You will go blank for section numbers. Well, you know it's in a TEPA, so you just go to the contents at the start. Oh, there it is, right. And then you know where to go to. So always highlight it in the contents as well as inside the act itself. If you think you won't remember which act it's in, think about highlighting the index in some way that will help you get there. And you can't, think about using different colours, which I've already mentioned, but you know how you will colour code and what will work for you. You cannot highlight everything. Most of it needs to be here. You can only highlight certain things. How is it going to be useful to me in the exam? For those of you doing ATT, you will not use the legislation at all for the short form questions. I think I've only ever seen one question that you sort of needed to use the legislation for. You're not going to use it for the short form questions. It's going to be the longer questions, and even then it'll be very few of those. At CTA, it's going to be a similar story. You will use the legislation a little bit more than you did at ATT, but not an immense amount more. It's going to be, oh, I better check that, I can't remember that one, or oh, I better just get to the highlight with my conditions so I can answer that. That's how it's going to be. Don't copy massive chunks of the legislation out. That's why you need to have prepared it. So you just get your key points out of the legislation. And if it's a letter to a client, do not quote the legislation. That is the wrong tone. A letter to a client should have no section numbers in at all. If the examiner asks for section numbers, put some section numbers in if you know them. But if you're running out of time, don't waste your time looking them up. Move on to another question, get some more marks elsewhere. I've just picked out a few examiner's comments when he talks about using the legislation for you. So, candidates will score marks for quoting statute where appropriate. So in a memo to a tax partner, as opposed to a letter to a client, you mustn't quote it to the client. Large number of candidates scored marks on this question, but additional marks could have been gained for identifying the correct statutory authority as required by the question. If he specifically asks you to quote statute, do please try and quote some section numbers. Here, sadly, the majority of students merely copied out the legislation, which would not have been valued by the client. You're writing to a client, you can't just copy the legislation, you have to explain it, dumb it down if you want, so the client understands it. Letters to a lay client should generally avoid technical references. Those to a finance director require more technical explanation, and those to a tax partner should have full legislation references and case law if you know it. Questions which simply require an explanation and you don't know who you're writing them to, again, full technical answer. But remember, all you've got there is the rules, not advice. You still have to understand it, yes, to actually be able to apply it or give advice. So that's the using the legislation bit of the talk. Anybody got any questions about that? I've put in quite a few more highlighting slides into that talk than you've got here, and if you're interested in those, just email me and I'll send you them, yes? And I've even got more. If you're interested in even more, I could just send you everything I've got. So it's up to you, but you know whether that's going to be useful to you or not. Okay. One thing I would say to you is if you've put a lot of effort into your books, highlighting them and you've got them just how you want them, take care of them. Because if they're in the office and a colleague takes a book and writes something in it, you can't take that book into the exam because it's now wrong, yes? Obviously you could take the chance that the invigilator won't see, but let's not go down that road, yes? So if you're going to put an awful lot of effort into getting your books highlighted beautifully, take care of them. But I did have one student who sat her exams in May. She had beautifully highlighted legislation, passed all her exams in May, sold them to her colleague for him to use in November. So they were ready to go. Of course, the thing is, highlighting is a bit personal. You have to know what suits you. But again, just be careful. You don't want someone coming along and making the books that you put all that effort into useless in the exam. Okay, so just going to do 20 minutes or so on exam technique, okay? Whether it's an ATT exam or a CTA exam, the approach is fairly similar. Obviously, you have to read the question. You might think this is obvious. Number of students who don't read the question carefully. I could have a pound for each of those students, I'll be in the Bahamas. Sometimes sitting back for a minute and planning, just a minute or so, thinking like, what's this about? What do I need to say? Can actually pay dividends than just ploughing straight in and regurgitating something and making a real dog's dinner of an answer. And then when you write, you need to write it in a specific way, carefully, and that's whether it's a numerical question or a written question. And most exams, it's 50-50 written to numbers. So what I thought we'd do is, I thought we'd go through this section by me picking out examiners' comments, just to bring home to you the importance of those three different steps. So across the papers, there was one theme that was commented on by most examiners, which was the candidate's failure to read the question. Read the full question, yes, all of it. Don't read the question you wish they'd set, read the question that's been set, yes? The reality is that a little more time spent before starting to write would pay massive dividends in terms of the marks you could gain. Candidates need to read and reread the question before starting to write. You have to ensure that if there are requirements, there's always requirements to the question, but if those requirements are broken down into parts, you respond to each bit of those requirements, because there's marks for each bit of that requirement. If the examiner highlights something you should not comment on, don't comment on it, because there's no marks, okay? And you're wasting time. And if you're doing a case study paper, you will be negatively marked if you do that, because that will lose you presentation marks. So where a question specifically states that certain things are not required, they're not required. Don't comment on them. So what you do is you go down through the question saying, what do I need to mention? Oh, I mustn't mention that. Now maybe you want to highlight that in different colours, maybe put red against something that you're not to talk about. If the question asks for the tax implications, it means more than one tax. If it only wants a single tax, it will tell you the single tax that it wants. So it just says income tax, that's all it wants. Corporation tax, that's all it wants. Don't comment on any other tax. But if it just says tax, think of as many taxes as could possibly be relevant. So think carefully, what is the examiner asking me for here? The well-prepared candidate laid out the computation differentiated between non-savings, savings and dividend income. I'm hoping you know that this is a basic income tax pro forma, yes? And you might think that most people would set it out in a logical way. No. Pro formas, learn them. Income tax pro forma, corporation tax pro forma, how you set out a VAT return, learn the pro forma. And where this is a good thing is when you get the exam and you're reading the question, you always read the requirements first, because the requirements set you up. So you know what it is you're looking at in a question. So income tax, calculate the income tax for Mr. Smith. Oh, I must be doing the income tax comp. Before I even read the question, I would have written up my pro forma. So there's my pro forma. And then as I read down through the question, I'll be ticking, oh, I can put that number in, or I need to do a worksheet with that, or I can put that number in. And as I'm reading the question, I can be slotting things into the pro forma. Same with a corporation tax comp. The examiner likes you to keep your workings, as if they're big workings, separate from your main answer. Looks neater, really nice, it's easier to follow. So, the majority of candidates separated out their computations from their workings. Candidates who scored less well tended not to show the workings at all. Never get your calculator and do that number and put that number on the answer. Because if that number's wrong, you don't get any of the marks for that number. You've shown the working, but the number's wrong because you can't use a calculator, which can happen. You will still get the marks. So show your workings and show them clearly. Explain why you have done things. Oh, principal private residence relief will apply. Why? Why will it? Spell it out, yes? Oh, you'll be subject to corporation tax. Why? When? Explain a little bit more. Try and support advice with calculations. So you should incorporate your business on the 31st of March. Well, why don't you do some calculations? Because if you do it on the 31st of March, you get this result, and if you do it on the 30th of April, you get this result. If the examiner, as a rule of thumb, gives you numbers, use them. Don't just do a written answer without using the numbers. He's put all that time and effort into working out numbers, please use them. Basic examination techniques of reading and answering the question and considering and addressing the information specifically provided helps you score more highly. Very rarely is there information in a question that's irrelevant. Now that's not always the case with the case study because it's all about filtering relevant from irrelevant information. But in the other exams, usually, if it's in a question, it's there for a reason. Now, you need to work out what the reason is, and you might not be able to work out what the reason is, but you need to try and address everything that's there. Even if it's to say, oh no, you can't have rollover relief because you've rolled over into shares, not the right kind of asset, yes? Even if it's to rule out something, you use the information to rule something out. It was clear from marking this question that a good layout and timely presentation of this sort of computational question gives a greater possibility of higher marks than a poor layout and messy presentation. If they can't follow what you're doing, they can't mark it. If it's a complete mess, you can't read your handwriting, markers are only human, they're only going to go so far and then they've had enough. Yes? You've got to try and make it easy for them to award you marks. This is not only because there are specific marks awarded for presentation, which there are, but also because an ordered approach to a computation reduces errors in what you're doing. If you have an ordered way of going about things, here's all my workings, I'll put that number now into this computation, you're less likely to forget things and make mistakes. Now, what's going to be very interesting is, you know, the Institute and the ATT, they publish a good student pass script on their website. Well, they're going to start, rather than typing them up, they're going to just sort of scan them and post the original script up there. And I bet you they've all got lovely handwriting and presentation, yes? Because that's the way people will score really nicely in the exam. If your handwriting is atrocious, you know who you are, and I'm not looking at anyone in particular, they're going to struggle to read what you're saying. And if your presentation is a mess, they're going to struggle to follow what you're doing. Especially if you've made a mistake and they're then supposed to be following through your workings. They're going to give up eventually if it's a complete mess. So you really need to think about presentation. That's where proformas can be really useful, because it tells you how to lay the thing out. Advice. Especially for the CTA exams, Chartered Tax Advisor, give advice. Don't say to a client, well, you could be this, it could be that, thank you, walk away. They want to know what they should do. So try and give advice. So where possible, don't just tell them you could do this, you could do that, you could do the other, and then not say what would be best. Say what would be best. What you shouldn't do, though, is just tell them what would be best without telling them what the options are, because there's only so much advice for telling what's best, and you've missed all the marks for the different options available. On the whole, candidates who laid out their answer well and took a step-by-step approach tended to score better. Part 2 was a difficult part of the question, but a good layout and a logical step-by-step approach, even in a really difficult question, you think, I don't really know what's going on here, but I'll just take it one step at a time and score marks. So it will help you, especially if you get something really difficult. Another example here, this is a question about whether companies are associated. And people just said, yeah, they're associated, or there's 6 associates, and not explained why. So sometimes you know it, you know why, you just need to take it that little bit further and show off your knowledge to the examiner. So for example, if in an income tax comp we had some income, like interest in an ISA that was exempt, don't just ignore it. Put down a little dash or somewhere, right, that's exempt income. Show off that you knew what it was, to get the half mark. Writing it up, again, as I think it's a common theme, you need to have really good presentation. You need to try and structure your answers so that they flow. The worst thing is an answer with an arrow going here and an arrow going there. Looks a mess. What would be much better in the exam is to leave lots of white space. And then if you do think of something later, you've got a bit of space to slot it in. They can't mark you down for white space. They provide the paper. Get your money's worth out of the paper, if nothing else. Use loads of it, yes? The style of the letter was often inappropriate and the layout was chaotic. The number of people who don't know how to write a letter, it's amazing. Because I think we don't, do we? I think there's a standard letter and we just fill the stuff in the middle, don't we? You need to go the whole hog and be able to do a letter. And when you're asked for a letter or a memo, there's specific presentation marks for that, and they're the easy marks. Questions which simply require an explanation should always be viewed as requiring a technical answer. Another common thing that students do, and I think it's a nerves thing, is they spend the first part of their answer repeating the question. Complete waste of time, yes? So try not to repeat the question, although do state what the problem is. So the problem is you've made a trading loss, and we now need to look at the options available to utilise that loss, rather than going straight into the options for your loss are. Because there will be some simple, easy marks for outlining the problem before you go on to the solution or options available. And again, here we go. Ensure your handwriting is legible. If you know you've got bad handwriting, sometimes a change in pen can actually make quite a difference. So practice with different pens, really. For numerical questions, obviously you need to have your pro formas off by heart. You need to support your calculations, so if there's workings, you need the workings there. You need to make sure there's a trail so they can follow where these numbers have come from. And it's what I call the two pieces of paper, the pro forma and the workings, the pro forma and the workings. Now, one thing you must be very careful about in both the ATT and the CTA exams, in the longer questions, is that when those all get handed in, they all get split up. So, because one marker marks all of question 1, one marker marks all of question 2. If you put your workings from question 1 accidentally behind question 2, you won't get marked. They're not going to try and find that other missing script, it just won't get marked. So you need to take some time at the end of every question to gather everything together that you know goes there, it's all in a logical order, and then you know what you do with it? You sit on it. Put it under your chair, because you don't need it anymore, and move on to the next question. Because if it's sitting there in front of you on your desk, what are you going to start doing? Going back to it and changing things. And when you change things, you always change for the worse, don't you? So once you've gathered it together and it's all ready to go, just sit on it and move on to the next question. And then there won't be any mixing up, things being handed in with the wrong questions. With a written question, think about whether you need a little plan. So I'll just sit back and wait a minute and just plan out what I need to do. Now, in a case study, you will need a plan. That's another story. But in all the other written exam questions, think about, do you need a plan? Watch out for format. If you've been asked for a specific format, make sure you do that. Who am I writing it to? Very technical, bit technical, not technical at all. And when it's going to a client, explain all terminology. Don't say CGT, say capital gains tax, in brackets CGT, and then off you go. Use CGT from then on in that question. Have this introduction. So set the scene, what's the problem, before you now get down into your answer. And be careful what you're saying. I know you'll say, oh, it's taxable. To which tax, yes? Taxable to which tax? Income tax, CGT? So just take it that little bit further to really spell it out. And say why you have said that. You get PPR relief because. You can have no personal allowance because. Take it just that little bit further. Even to a partner, think of them as really stupid and you need to really spell everything out to them even though it's a technical answer. With letter writing, if you've been given names and addresses, use them. But if you've not been given addresses, you will be given names. If you've not been given addresses, then it's quite sufficient to put our address, your address, or headed note paper, and that's much quicker. But if you've been given information like addresses, you must use it. And again, if it's a dear sir, it's going to be a yours faithfully. If it's dear Mr. Smith, it's going to be a yours sincerely. It's very, very old-fashioned. No higher, no KRs, none of that. We want proper formal letters. Keep it short and snappy. yourself because you only get the marks once. So you say it once and only. Keep it nice and short and snappy. Put in lots of headings, leave lots of space. What I say to my students is, get your 20 points down, leave lots of space, and then you can start expanding on each of those points. You'll run out of time, but you've got most of the marks. It's where you only make 5 points, which you've expanded in great detail, that you won't pass that question, because you needed to make 20 different points, yes? So get the stuff down, leave the space, and go back to pad it out later. That's the way to pass this exam. Timing is a nightmare. Every time you start a question, 1.8 minutes per mark, you write the stop time. And the minute you get to the stop time for that question, you stop, no matter what. No matter how much more you could write, you must move on and go to the next question. Because it's much easier to get the first half marks in that question than the remaining marks in the last question. And if you've overrun on a question, you just make the rest of the paper even more time pressured, and you just don't need that to happen. I always hope, it's a nasty thing, but I always hope when I set mock exams in class that students overrun, because then they realise what an absolute nightmare they made for themselves, and they definitely will not do it in the real thing. You need to watch your time, allocate your time, and you need to practice to time. It's all very well sitting there and spending 3 hours on a 20-mark question. You're not going to have 3 hours to do a 20-mark question in the exam. Practice for time. Even if you just say, God, how far have I only got? Oh, there's so much more to write, yes? Just to give yourself an idea of how time pressured these things can be. There we go, 1 hour. I've done it. Any questions for me? Well, I know you're all a bit shy. So if there are any questions, you can come and ask me afterwards or email me anything, yes? I'm quite good on email. You might get my out of office, but that's me just filtering my colleagues, not you. Never filter students. So just feel free to ask. So no more questions?
Can you just tell us a bit more about using abbreviations?
Right, abbreviations, you really have to define them all the time. So even if you're going to say IHT, you have to put inheritance tax IHT, yes?
Even if it's to a partner?
Even if it's to a partner, I would maybe to a partner. Classic ones like IHT and CGT, you might be all right with. But be careful if you've got your own abbreviations. Like I would say ER for Entrepreneurs Relief. You just couldn't use that. You'd have to fully spell it out. But you can say it in full and then put your abbreviation in brackets and then move on with that for the rest of that question. Now, what the examiner has a real habit of doing is giving these questions, the people or the companies, enormous, massive, long names that you just don't want to keep repeating. So get this, Allied Access, Limited, and then put in brackets A Limited. And then from then on, you can just do A Limited, and it just speeds you up, really. But I would say for abbreviations, unless it's a classic one to a partner, I would spell everything out. Anything else? No? Okay, if you are you are leaving, obviously you all are leaving now, and you go out via the first floor, so you go out of the lifts, and you sort of go into the stairwell where the stairs are, and there's a door in front of you with a little button that you press, you push the door, and you're out, and unfortunately you're on the ramp to that car park. But it was lovely to see you all. I hope you have found it interesting. If you do want the rest of the slides, email me. And have a lovely evening, what's left of it. Thank you for coming.